Dr. Russ Dollinger mastered anatomy despite having aphantasia, which is sometimes defined as the lack of a mind's eye. Now, as a scientist with expertise in embryology, brain biochemistry, and cell biology, he's also an inventor and an entrepreneur. And when I saw one of his recent inventions through his company Science Glen, I knew I had to share this deck of cards with you. Now, you know I'm a fan of cards overall, but I'm especially a fan of innovative ways for people to learn. Now, although you might not need to know chemistry, you'll definitely appreciate knowing about Russ's thinking on learning complex information, how that he has solved certain things. And, if chemistry and anatomy aren't the most challenging of all the information types, they're pretty close. So join me now as Russ and I discuss how he managed to get a PhD despite brain injury and aphantasia, how he's used mnemonics in teaching, and the incredible thinking behind these ion flashcards, and a related invention he'll be releasing soon to help students and educators alike. And I think you'll just appreciate knowing, even if you're not in these fields, what he's come up with, because you never know when an idea is going to transfer to something else and you have an amazing aha moment that solves a learning problem you might have. This is Dr. Anthony Metivier from magneticmarymethod.com. You're listening to the Magnetic Mary Method podcast. Please get subscribed if you're new to the show. And for the love of memory, hit that thumbs up if you've got one, or leave a review so the robots don't forget to help spread the good news about new innovations, things like this that people like Russ are putting together for you over at Science Glen. Russ, thanks so much for joining me on the Magnetic Mary Method podcast to talk about some interesting learning experiences that you've had with aphantasia and memory loss. And, I don't want to bury the lead here, but also these ion flashcards that you've put together. So I want to hear about the history about that. But maybe start with this dramatic story you were just telling me about dealing with anatomy in depth to, credentialed levels and not having a strong mind's eye.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Pardon me. My mother was an artist. She died recently, but and my son is a tattoo artist.
Wow.
And it just skipped me. And
do you have any tattoos?
No,
You haven't let him ink you up?
Yeah, right. I'm sure he'd be interested. So no, I don't really have any ability to visualize things. I think pictures. I don't see them. And to me, the best way I describe it, I don't really have a full-blown case of aphantasia. It's sort of like looking through a dirty shower glass door. And I have a very good sense of what is good design and so on. And I've won actually a Gold Ink Award for some books that I did for, the quality of the color and the separations and stuff like that. So I've done that. So, but in terms of visualizing something, I can't do that. My brother, on the other hand, he can look at a blueprint, see the building in his mind, turn the building around in his mind and tell you what the back of the building looks like. It's just amazing ability, but I don't have that. And so I have a PhD in anatomy. I kind of got into it. I was doing a thing where we were injecting plastic into chicken embryos while they were alive. These were, just like out of the shell, and then basically using scanning electron microscopy when it first came out to look at what those, vessels look like. So I was visualizing it in practice, in real life. So when I, and I was able to go continue in that direction to anatomy, and I went and I got a PhD in anatomy at UCLA, oriented most toward cell biology and brain biochemistry, neurochemistry. And but when I was actually going through gross anatomy, I mean, there's microscopic anatomy. I had very little problem with that, but gross anatomy, you have to visualize things on which side it is, or neuroanatomy. So I was just reading this morning about the ventromedial aspect of the prefrontal cortex. And I'm going, ventral, that's on the bottom, and medial, that's toward the inside, and prefrontal's in the front of, and I have to kind of build it out that way. Well, on the bottom of the skull, there are all these little teeny holes and cavities where the blood vessels go through, where nerves have gone through. And it used to be just torture for me to figure it out. Or an area of the body between the anus and the genitals is called the perineum. very complicated area of the body, lots of stuff going on there. And I just had terrible trouble with that. So to me, and so I would always have to kind of dissect in my mind, so to speak, no pun intended. I would have to kind of build it out in my mind, all right, ventral, that's on the bottom of it, or medial, that's on the inside versus lateral. And I would have to kind of work it out that way to do that and build up a structure, because I don't see it at all that way. I mean, it isn't automatic for me at all.
I've long been interested in aphantasia and have had, when I was a kid, what they called imagination deficit disorder, because I couldn't learn to play music the way they wanted me to learn how to play music. And I think that was probably some early term for aphantasia that these people didn't know, and so forth. And although I wouldn't call my visualization looking through murky shower glass, it certainly has in my first book, long before aphantasia blew up on the scene, I was talking about this, and I was talking about how it's like ghostly, it's not really visualizing, all this sort of stuff. And one of my stopping points with it, in addition to like, let's have DSM-V6 and, or whatever, like all these new terms, just shovel them in left, right, and center. My stopping point is that I've taught university as a professor for 10 years. And I've seen people explain to me every excuse under the sun why they can't do things, right? And I don't find that aphantasics are somehow special or unique. There's people amongst them who get it done, regardless of how they experience this. And information display is a huge thing. There are people who can visualize perfectly their day at the beach and all this sort of stuff, but they get visually overwhelmed by diagrams and charts and graphs and all this sort of stuff. So it just seems to me that there's some other factor that we need to really, really focus on, rather than another term to describe why so-and-so can't do a thing. Because I did go on tour with a band in my career, regardless of them giving me a hard time because I couldn't learn music the way they wanted me to. You know what I mean?
Sure, I do. I know exactly what you mean. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's different ways that people cope. I mean, the history of aphantasia from when it was first discovered, I mean, people didn't believe, the scientists who came up with it didn't believe there was such a thing as a mind's eye, because all the people they were oriented with and talking with, none of them had it. And then when they actually researched it, discovered that maybe only 5% of the population doesn't have a mind's eye. But one of the books that I was reading not long ago was basically describing how everybody's brain is basically different. There's similarities. I mean, we have certain aspects that are similar, but each person has their own set of experiences that change the myelination of the brain and the plasticity and the backgrounds and the experiences. And so how we relate to things is different. I mean, so my mother, if I said, do you imagine a dog? She literally saw the dog. I mean, literally, I mean, every little teeny aspect of it. So one of the advantages for me was that because I think pictures, when my kids were little, we had this sort of driveway with a carport, which was really dark at night. The lights were broken. And so I would drive in there and start telling scary stories. And for me, it was easy as get out to talk about worms crawling in and weird stuff happening. And my son, who was incredibly visual, was just freaking out, because for him, it was real. For me, it was just abstract. It was thinking. Right. So it was an advantage for me. And that's been an advantage as well for some of the scientific kind of things that I've done.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because I sometimes have to catch myself. I describe things very vividly, but I can do it because I'm not, actually engaging in it in the way that perhaps the listener is, which is interesting. But let's focus on, how did you manage to, I mean, what's involved in a PhD in anatomy anyway? I mean, it sounds intense on its face, and it obviously is, but how did you manage to absorb the information? What were the steps that you followed to make it work?
So any PhD, of course, is difficult. I mean, it's, it took me 10 years. Okay. So the average length for a PhD is, 5 or 6 years, I think, for most people. I was stupid. It took me longer. So,
I wouldn't go that far, but
That's the way I describe it. So, it's interesting because getting a PhD is very much entrepreneurial training, because you have to come up with your own idea. You have to find the funding for it. You have to sell people on the idea. You have to then do the research or do the work. And then you have to present it in a way and convince a set of professors that your work is valid and has done the right thing and so forth. And so I was like I said, I was in a department of anatomy at UCLA. And I was really very interested in a thing called gangliosides. I don't know if you know what those are. There's a kind of a special kind of a sugar fat or glycosphingolipid. Have you ever heard of Tay-Sachs disease?
I don't think that I have explicitly, but perhaps
Well,
in the periphery.
Tay-Sachs disease is actually an autosomal recessive, not an uncommon disease. In the regular population, maybe 1 in 300 people are carriers. In the Jewish Ashkenazi population, maybe 1 in 30 are. And if two carriers get married, 1 in 4 of their children get the disease. And so we have sugars, or these sugar fats, that are found only in the central nervous system, and they're built up and they're broken down, and they're built up and they're broken down. Well, the enzyme that does the breaking down in that situation doesn't work right. And so it builds up and up and up, and the baby dies by about age 2 or 3, always. And there are a bunch of these kind of diseases in different populations, many of them. And I was interested in that. And as it happened, I was the only one at UCLA who was interested in this field at all. And there are a lot of people interested in this now, but at the time there wasn't. And it was really oriented towards cell biology. And so I actually got I found a person who was a lipid biochemist in a different department, and he was willing to take me into his lab. And so I ended up basically having to follow and pass the requirements for both the anatomy department and the biochemistry department. So I almost had to take like 2 exams for each of these and convince everybody, which was intense. But I managed to get through it. It took me a while, but I got through it. And shortly after I did postdoctoral work in another department at UCLA in cell biology, and then came up with the idea that I wanted to go and be an entrepreneur and be an inventor. And I left academics.
Wow.
Jump ship, right? And I decided I was going to go into doing some business on my own. And about I don't know, just a couple, 3 months, about 5 months after I decided to leave academics, and I was trying to figure out exactly where I was going to do and how I was going to position it. I was walking across the street one day, and a drunk driver ran into me at about 40, 45 miles an hour, drunk, and I flew up over the top of the car and landed on my head. My friend told me I went up about 10 feet in the air and landed on my head, and I had a shattered left leg and torn knee and broken arm and lots and lots of brain damage and hematomas. And I woke up in the hospital, and and I went from hospital to hospital, and I was in the hospital for, I don't know, a couple of months. But when I first kind of woke up in the hospital, it was like, why am I here? And my leg was all with all kinds of metal rods all over it, and my arm was all twisted up and everything. And they said, oh, well, you had this accident. And about 10 minutes later, I asked the same question. I had enormous short-term memory loss, problems. And that took a while. So, but there's a really interesting thing that happened with that. So I forgot the name of everything. All the labels of things were gone. So, I had a PhD in anatomy, and so I knew all these names and nerves and muscles and whatnot. I couldn't remember the name of anything. And I knew that I drank tea, but not coffee. Okay, so I drink tea, but not coffee. But I didn't remember much else.
Did you remember which teas that you liked, or just tea as a category?
No, black and green. I drink a lot of green tea. Yeah.
Okay.
and olive oil. I watched your video. And so, and so do you remember, there are these things that everybody has in their life, like when you were a little boy and you wet your pants and you were embarrassed. Remember those things?
Unfortunately.
I remember that they happened, but all the emotional affect was gone. I didn't care. It was like, oh, okay, that happened. And I had that memory of it, but there was no emotion connected to it at all. And so, in addition, one of the other weird things that happened was that, I would see a mark on the wall, or everybody, for example, poop smells bad, right?
Typically, yeah.
Right. Well, it has a strong smell, but bad is a term we use, a filter to describe it. We're taught that. So I would see a mark on the wall and I'd say, mark on the wall. It wasn't, oh, they're dirty, it's not clean, they should have somebody marked it, whatever. I would just be mark on wall. So somebody would walk in the room and I would be practically, I would be like, when an adult is reacting with a baby and the baby's able to pick up the adult's emotions. Well, it was sort of like that. All my filters were gone. And I mean, our filters protect us from this huge volume of information that we're bombarded with all the time. Like, do you feel the pressure on your feet? Now you do because I mentioned it. But before you didn't, because we filter that out because we have only, 8 bits of working memory available. And so
is that the reticular activating system that is involved
yeah,
in
no,
that?
well, I don't think it's so much the reticular activating system. I think it's more like the hippocampus.
Right.
And the reticular activating feeds into that. But then that's a good question. Exactly, how that works out. The so I mean, I had to have a new set of filters, and when they finally let me out of the hospital and I was going home, I had to close my eyes. It was, oh my God, red car, blue car, it's up, it's down. Oh my God, it's too much information. And gradually, I built up a new set of filters to deal with the world. So, and the best way that I can describe this is that and my memory mostly recur. I mean, it's my amazing personality from getting whacked in the head. But I think mostly my memory return. I mean, I had obviously traumatic brain injury, and I had to rebuild all sorts of memories. And I went through list after list after list of things to reconnect it. Like I remember I was tormented by the word benign. Or biopsy, that is, biopsy, like when they would take a piece of tissue out to see what's wrong. I mean, I knew the term and I could not remember the name. And I remember going through list after list until I happened to find, oh, there it is. And I reconnected it, and reestablished the connection. And over time, I was able to rebuild most of those connections. Now, how much of a permanent change there was from that? I still have troubles with names. I tend to screw up names, So if I call you Bob, please forgive me.
Well, I look like a Bob. Well, that's quite extraordinary. But people are going to kill me if I don't go back to how did you deal with the extraordinary amount of names in anatomy? I mean, I'm thinking like you got things like the scaphoid, which also is the navicular, like all these things that even have multiple names. What do you remember what it was that you did before this accident to get the PhD that even if you ultimately went off on a different career, what you did to learn those things?
Repetition. I guess repetition and context. I think that would be the major thing. I mean, mnemonics, I never really much liked, I was in the Navy and they told us this dirty set of phrases, which is not for public consumption, to remember the resistor color code.
Okay.
And there's also one for the, cranial nerves. And I always found that it was like twice as much work. I'd have to remember the mnemonic and then I have to remember what the mnemonic equals. And that was harder than just remembering it for me.
See, that's always
so,
a sign that you're not yet that whoever taught the mnemonics was not teaching mnemonics, because that's not proper form, shall we say?
probably not. So I mean, I'm not sure exactly I know how I did it. I mean, I just just by force of will, more than anything, I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and I
Mm.
did it over and over and over and over. Repetition. Sometimes I used flashcards. Sometimes, so one of the things I remember doing when I was in my senior year of college was, and I was at, I don't know, biochemistry class or organic chemistry class or something like that. Pardon me. And it was, I discovered that one of the things that was very useful was to review the book backwards.
Mm.
And so I would say, all right, I'm here. What has to happen for those things to happen?
Right.
Now, what has to happen for that thing to happen? And I found that by connecting it in a different way, I was able to do better. Now, another thing that I did often was when I was studying for my PhD exams. I mean, they basically, at least, it's different for every university, but at UCLA, the way it worked was they give you 6 questions and you write all day long on 3 of those. And when I did it, it was a while ago, and it was literally ball and pen, and handwriting it.
Yeah.
And so you have to know everything, basically. You have to know anything that, you don't know what they're going to ask. It could be about anything. Anything to do with anatomy or neurophysiology or neuroanatomy or brain biochemistry, whatever it's going to be about, you just don't know. And so, I mean, I remember giving myself a question and then writing and writing and writing and writing, and then practicing. And I did practice drawing because I'm not a very good artist. And so I figured out a way to draw things. And so I taught high school science for many years, chemistry, biology, physics, mostly chemistry. And so I had to do drawings on the board, which were rather cartoon-like, and kids would laugh at me, and my mother was probably rolling over in her grave, but they worked. And I was able to get across the ideas. And that was sort of the way that I was able to do it with the graphics that I did. So, I can't answer. I mean, I don't know how to describe it. I mean, I don't have I don't know if I don't have a good memory. I mean, I have a functional memory.
Mm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, you're the expert at this. Tell me, how did I manage to do it?
Well,
Please enlighten me.
just as a general observation, and obviously we can't do some sort of super hyper specific time machine, looking into it. But as I observe what you're saying, the first thing to say is, a lot of people, they think that I'm like hell bent against repetition, and I'm not. Repetition, mnemonics help with repetition, and they help better when they're formed better. But the fact that you just did what it took to form the memories, and if repetition was the tool that was working for you, mnemonic just largely is an umbrella term for memory technique. So it was a memory technique that got the job done. Now, when you talk about thinking backwards, this is a very good strategy, and it is related to a part of the world of spaced repetition. Because as you're thinking back through things over time, one of the best things that you can do is to think of them in different orders. So,
Mhm.
an amplification of that would be not only backwards, but then try to skip the chapters, like interleave them. So, chapter 13, then chapter 11, and then chapter 9, and then go back to 10 and 12, and like all that sort of stuff. That can give it an extra boost. But just the idea of working backwards is a very creative form of repetition. And that's generally what I promote in addition to, let's say, proper form in mnemonics. And I'm like exaggerating that, but there actually are ways to use mnemonics in a much more targeted way. Like I just named 2 of the carpal bones, right? And I only had to look at those names once, and I created images, and I can go on with the lunate and the triangular and the pisiform and the capitate and the lunate. Or did I say the lunate already? I'm missing one. A hamate, that's what it is. And sometimes I get a little bit confused. Is it trapezium, or is it trapezoid or whatever? But at the end of the day, I could fix that, because if it is trapezium, then I add red rum from The Shining, because it's that sort of thing. And I think that's what it is. But nonetheless, maybe there is a trapezoid in there. Anyway, you get a little bit weak sometimes because I actually have no reason to know my carpal bones. So I just did it for a student one time. But at the end of the day, what I did there with maybe 80% accuracy is proper mnemonic form, because when it's pisiform, it's not a weak mnemonic. It's a very strong mnemonic because, is that right? Actually, you're the anatomy PhD. I should ask you.
Yeah, little teeny bone right here.
Yeah. So it's the right word. I had Prince, the musician, not the magician, the musician. I'm trying to say two words at once. The musician Prince roller skating on pizza in a formation, right? Like that sort of thing. And like capitate is Captain Crunch. And so I'm not actually rebuilding anything that makes it twice as much work. It's just noticing, you know, that Captain Crunch, capitate, that sort of thing. Uh, lunate, it's a little bit of a stretch, but ABBA sings Waterloo. So you just go with these sorts of things. And
Those are great.
Yeah, the
Those are great.
problem.
So I remember once I was substituting in a chemistry classroom and I just walked in, pardon me, and they were studying gas laws. Now, there's a law called Boyle's law that the pressure times the volume is equal to a constant. And so I was saying, all right, well, here's how you remember this. Imagine that you have this pig and he's vacuuming and he's going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And he does it so many times he gets a boil on his hand. That's Boyle's law. And so I was basically a picture or a story using a similar idea. And I guess, would you call that a mnemonic?
Absolutely. And it's what I would call proper form, because you're looking for an exact correspondence. And when you can't find an exact correspondence, you go for the next best thing. Right. And so when people feel that mnemonics are too much work, it's usually because they're using vague abstractions that don't leap out at you. But a boil for Boyle, is already just so much more evocative. And then people say, yeah, but what am I going to do with something super, abstract or whatever? And the reality is if you can spell it as a word, it ain't abstract. That's not what abstract means. And then you just look at the words and you figure out what's going to be the closest thing. So Prince on pizza for pizza form, it's just, and there is certainly about a bit of training to it, to train your mind to be specific in that way. But you nailed it. Boyle for Boyle. I mean, and if you can't use like the Boyle, there's Susan Boyle who won all those Britain's Got Talent, stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Or da 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 da. And heaven forbid you would look up on the internet and see a picture of Boyle. Probably he was in a time before photographs. So I'm not sure, but these kinds of things. Like you can find ways to make it more real for you. And if you can't find the fun in that, then you got a different problem. It comes back to sort of what I was saying before. I just don't buy the idea that aphantasia is a barrier. If anything, I find that when people fixate on it as a problem, they make it a problem. But it can be a leaping point. We have so many successful people that, like yourself, who just make it happen.
The people that came up with the idea of aphantasia were like the top scientists of the time. I mean, they weren't held back at all because they didn't know there was anything to be held back by. It wasn't an issue, really. So, but now, one of the things that you mentioned though was abstract, and the idea of, one of the things. So I've come up with these flashcards. Let me explain why.
Yes, let's look at these.
Yeah. So I taught chemistry for many years, and unlike biology or physics, I mean, you can see things rolling down and speeding up and falling and how far and how fast and so on. But chemistry is got three things that you have to combine together. And so teachers of chemistry for the last 100 years have described the problem is you have microscopic, macroscopic, and symbolic. And you have to combine all those together. And that's very hard for a 15-year-old who's doing that. And there are many people who say that a 15-year-old just doesn't have the memory ability yet, or the maturity, the brain maturity to really understand that. So I see you're holding the card. So imagine now that you have some lye, and lye is sodium hydroxide. So here I've got a sodium. I don't know if is that backwards. You're seeing it right way.
I see it the right way. No, it's fine.
Okay, good. Okay, and then you have, let's say, hydroxide. Okay, so now, when I would, I struggled for years to, when they combine together. So if you have a positive ion because it's lost an electron, and you have a negative ion because it gained an electron. They're attracted together, electrostatic attraction. And so, but it has to equal 0. It has to add up to 0. So if you have something that's +1, you have to have something that's -1. If you have +2, you have to have 2 minuses. It has to add up to 0. And I struggled teaching that with kids. I did videos, and I did PowerPoints, and I did little drawings on the board, and everything I did, just nothing worked. One thing that did seem to help were flashcards. And I would even go and buy them myself and have students write them out. And then the students who actually took the time to study them and repeat them did better. And then they did a lot better, right?
Yo.
So in the periodic table, sodium is in column 1 of the periodic table. Things in column 1 tend to lose 1 electron. You see sodium? It loses 1 electron and becomes Na plus. So it has a charge of +1. And by losing 1 electron, that stuff down there is the way the electrons are configured, it becomes more stable. Okay? Now, on the other hand, hydroxide, that's a bit more complicated. It's a couple of ions, kind of atoms stuck together. It ends up having a charge of -1. Okay? So now, if it has to add up a 0, if you got a +1 and a -1, the formula would be NaOH. And that's what lye is. You know, that's how they used to make soap, is they would take meat and they would cook it for a while, or ash from like a piece of wood, and they would either get potassium hydroxide or sodium hydroxide, and they would then use that to make soap, among other things. So that's NaOH. Now, on the other hand, barium loses 2 electrons, and so instead of it being Ba, it's in the second column of the periodic table. It loses 2 electrons, so now it's got a charge of 2+. So now, if that would be the case, and if I want it to be 0, well, then I'd have to have 2 of the negatives to balance the +2. So I would have to have BaOH2 with parentheses. And students get horribly confused by this. And but at least if they use the flashcards, then they didn't have to wonder, oh, hydroxide, what's hydroxide? Oh, it's OH. But still, there was a problem with it conceptually. So I came up with something that's in production right now in China. And so I came up with these things here. This is an ionic, I call this the ionic bonding disk model. There's a sodium, it's got a plus. It lost 1 electron, it's got a charge of +1. And I have a hydroxide here. Hydroxide, oops, I'll do it that way. And it's got a charge of -1 here. And whoop, they stick together. So now the formula is NaOH. And now on the other hand, let's say I have barium. Well, barium has got 2 pluses. So I need to have now 2 hydroxides. So it makes it obvious. And when I actually came up with this model, and these are patent pending, it's got 2 patents pending on it. When I came up with this model, and at first I started with just literally pieces of paper stuck together, and then wood and paper, and then finally these things with magnets inside and being made and so on. When I actually tested it with students, there was a 33 to 44% improvement in understanding in one 15-minute training. And I went and I asked a special ed teacher, why does this work so well? You know, what is it about this thing that it makes it work so well? And she said, it's what they call in teacher talk, a manipulative. You can touch it, you can feel it, you hear it, and it snaps together, you know, and it's got this nice clicking sound when it snaps together. And it's like, oh, it's obvious. And I had one student say, Dollinger, why didn't you teach us this way before? Well, I hadn't invented it yet, you know.
Well, let me compliment you, because that's exactly the right move, I think, in a time where, listen, this is my criticism. I'm a little bit biased here, of course, but nonetheless, we're in a time where people who have large channels and large podcasts and so forth are saying that the studies that, you know, being offline does not help your dopamine and all that sort of stuff. they're really pushing this, and then they sell you their online app or the app that they're receiving money to advertise, which will teach you the sciences, and I'm not going to name the companies and so forth, but they're so unnuanced on this topic about how getting offline doesn't really affect your dopamine. And look, to be intellectually generous, they're not incorrect about these cherry-picked studies, but they're doing it because they have an app that they want to sell you. And we have problems with spatial memory and trying to figure out how to map in our brains where things are. So, there's a term that goes around called the revenge of analog. And this card system where you've got an index and people can quickly find the specific ion is that they have to find, and then the idea of being able to snap things together in space through manipulative learning. This is exactly the right move. So my compliments to you, especially at this time, because we're living in an intellectually bankrupt, and I'm all for the free market and all that sort of stuff. But when people start to cherry pick studies so that they can still get you to buy a subscription to an online learning platform, we're in dangerous times.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if you remember back, to when the computer first started coming around and people were saying, oh, everything is going to be online. Everybody's going to learn everything online. And I mean, before they really even called it online, everybody's going to learn things with computers, and you're not going to need teachers anymore. And of course, one of the things that happened as a result of the pandemic is everybody discovered how horribly wrong that is and how it does not work. And
not only that, but we have like 4 times the amount of paper as a result of everything being online.
That's right. Computers are going to make everything work better, except computers time. And so what I found though was, like, you still need to know the names of things like a hydroxide, and flashcards really are just a very efficient way of doing the repetition. It doesn't have to be flashcards. It could be writing it out. It could be quizzes, repeating it over and over. It's got a manipulative effect to it. I mean, it feels good in the hand and so on. But aside from these, whatever, I mean, it works. Now, as far as the haptic thing that you get with these models, and this could be connected up in terms of I have some ideas of actually putting a little microprocessors inside of there and sending the signal off to somebody's phone as well, and other features like it's got this size and shape and whatnot. But just the old-fashioned ways still work better in many cases, and people loved them and did them over and over because they worked so well. It's sort of like the classics. So at one point I went back and I started reading some of the, the classic books that everybody said were so good. And I discovered they're considered classics because they're good. They're really good. And some of the old-fashioned learning techniques are really, really good. So when I was listening to the video that you had with the indigenous professor, and
Tyson Yunkaporta.
Right. I mean, talking about whole concepts, like life concepts to learn a term. And if you think about the semiotics of 30, 40,000 years when people came up with language, this is in your field really more than mine, when people started coming up with ways to describe the world, they came up with different terms to describe it, whether there should be a male and a female, or whether you talked about something as being living or dead, like some of the Canadian Indian languages and so on. And I think it was Inuit. And, so old-fashioned ways of learning worked, and people were able to repeat poems and books and music and be fluent in 15 languages and things like that without having computers.
Yeah. I mean, let's be fair. I'm not anti-computer. I love computers. I love everything about well, I don't love everything about it, but I think criticism, hesitation, all that stuff is not opposition, but there is this sadness where a lot of people just lose the fundamentals, and then they're often the first to complain, like, well, I can't play a musical instrument. Well, yeah, you didn't put an instrument in your hands, and then I don't know enough about chemistry to say this, but I have an idea in my mind that the reason to be able to balance these equations to zero would be so that you could actually make something and not blow yourself up, So having it in your hands from the get-go would almost logically be a process of care in the laboratory that you're heading towards working in. I don't know, maybe.
Well, let's look at a simple example like table salt. That's sodium chloride. It's got Na plus. It loses one electron, becomes positively charged, and chloride picks up that one electron or picks it up from somewhere. And so you have a positive and you have a negative, they stick together, and that's the way things are found. People study chemistry because that's how to describe the world works. So interesting thing, I don't know if it was in one of your videos or something you just said just now, just a moment ago. One of the things that I found teaching chemistry, particularly in the last year, after the pandemic, students started coming back into class, was that they were all ever so much ready to not try and memorize things on their own, because I can ask Dr. Google, Siri, what's this? Siri, what's that? And so they didn't feel any need to learn anything or to memorize anything. But then when it came time to actually needing to do it, or I'd be talking about, here's this thing on the board. Look, you got barium chloride, you got silver nitrate, and I put them together. What's going to happen? And they were just lost because they didn't learn the terms. And when I actually started using the flashcards, and I insisted you must use these flashcards, the ones who actually did better. And the classroom as a whole was just more fun, and everybody did better in general. It's an old-fashioned technique and so on. But when, a lot of around the late 70s, early 80s, mid 80s, people kind of got the feeling that, particularly in science, everything should be inquiry based. You don't need to memorize anything. You got to figure it out. You can do it. Conceptually, you can figure everything out. But while I can figure out the charge of a barium ion or a sodium ion by where it is on the periodic table, or chloride ion, where it is on the periodic table, if you know that, and it's not too big, that's your memory map, really. That's really how it works. Then you can figure that out. But when it comes to what are called polyatomic ions, where you have several atoms stuck together and they have an overall charge, you just have to memorize it. You can figure it out but it takes a while to do it. It's just faster and easier to memorize it. Way faster. So sulfate is SO4 2 minus. Well, you can figure that out by where the electrons are positioned if you have a pencil and paper and you want to write that, but it's just easier to memorize.
Yeah. I wonder, this idea that I believe you mentioned that some people say that, 15-year-olds aren't ready to deal with this sort of stuff. And then, I wonder about that, because when I look at this, not really knowing what it is, and this shows my age, but I see O, I think of Oscar the Grouch. I see C, I think of Cookie Monster. I see N, I think of the Loch Ness Monster. And then there's a minus. Well, it's Loch Ness Monster is at the end, so he's just got a sword or something like this, right? So I can't imagine that a 15-year-old in their own pop culture world can't think of a character for O or C or N and have, a traditional, like when we talk about the old classics, in the medieval and the Renaissance era, they had what's called a bestiary, and they had an animal for every single letter in order to help them remember these things.
So turn the card over. Turn that card over. Right. Now, cyanate.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you then, using that same way of doing it, how would you think about that? Cyanide is they were used for killing people, among other things, but cyanate.
Well, I remember, and this is again, like I show my age when I think of mnemonics, but I remember, I think it was Cy from the men's hair club or hair club for men or whatever. And, I'm not just the CEO, I'm also a client. And that guy's name was Cy, I believe.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
So I think I would think of him, and then cyanate. So he maybe I have a time machine there. And in the past tense, he ate ion, which is one of the Platonic dialogues. And, if I didn't know ion, one of the Platonic dialogues, I might think of an Ian or something like that. But even better, if you have your proper mnemonic systems, you look at 81 and you could have an image for that, which I have an image for that, which is fat based on the major method. And more specifically, it's when Weird Al dressed as Michael Jackson, really fat for that song. So for every number, you can have an image. And whenever, you're dealing with like 180 is here on the angle, That's a very simple set of images. 18 is a TV and 0 is a donut. So, and I also have, you censored yourself with military language, but I won't censor myself. TV is also the transvestite from Rocky Horror Picture Show, which I knew in high school. When I was 15, we were doing the time warp and singing about transvestite, but Dracula and all this sort of stuff. So, like, I would have had images for that when I was 15. Um, it's just a matter of somebody teaching them that, you know,
Right.
and it's a classic.
Yeah.
It's the classic of classics.
So you did mention, I mean, I think you did mention, or you referred to that. I mean, the value of actually teaching memory techniques to students in school. And I think there's a lot of value in that. I think very, very few teachers do that. That's not done very often. I didn't, I should have, I basically insisted on the flashcards.
You did it with Boyle.
Yeah, that was with one class, but and I tried that with a few others. And so one of the things that I was often dealing with, I mean, every teacher nowadays deals with, is you have students on their phones and, they're constantly tuning out. And so it's hard. Some schools have actually gone to the effect of banning phones literally from the school. Some are, basically locking them up during the day and so on. But many teachers don't want to deal with that, especially because, parents, because of possible crime and shooting events and whatnot, especially in America, you don't want to take the phones away from kids, etc. So
yeah, but you'd be better able to run in a zigzag formation if you weren't 5 seconds behind the game because you're sitting there staring at a phone.
Yeah, maybe so. So anyway, I mean, so so I forgot what I was going with this.
Well, I think part of the issue is that, and let me ask you this way. This is my pet theory. I don't know how to do it, but I think that the onus is really on the teachers to learn memory techniques themselves. And I, in fact, if I were the boss of the world or the president of the United States, insofar as the president has the power to do such things, I would say, look, you don't get a teaching certificate unless that you can memorize 30 names in less than 3 minutes and you know all of your students' names. This would almost certainly encourage teachers to be teaching mnemonics because they themselves would be good enough to use them themselves. And then it would trickle to the students much more, quote unquote, naturally because the teachers were qualified to do it.
So I would modify that just a little bit.
Please.
So what I learned when I was, in the academic ivory tower, the thought of anything business was dirty. I mean, I remember going to the business library at UCLA and looking around and hoping to dear God nobody saw me go into that dirty building because I was just horrible. I'm going to go sell things. Nothing could be worse than that, right?
Yeah, good old slave morality, alive and well.
I actually got into business. I came to discover that, in fact, everybody sells. Everybody. And the people who sell the best do the best. Whether it's Einstein, who was a brilliant self-branding person. I mean, he was brilliant, but he also was very good at branding. Or whether it's a preacher selling God, or a carsman selling a used car, or a teacher selling an idea. The people who sell the best are the ones who do the best. So if you insisted every teacher has to, be able to teach mnemonics, it's really having a relationship with students is really about having a relationship, and you're leading them, you're motivating them to care, to want to learn. And here's this neat technique, and let me teach you these really amazing, memory techniques that'll make it easier for you to learn and get into the school you want to get into, versus you will learn this. Here's how you do it. And kids pick up on that right away, and they'll immediately do the opposite. They don't want to have anything to do with it. They'll just tune out, and that'll be the end of that. So it's really more about, if anything, you're going to teach if you're going to insist the teacher do anything, teach them how to motivate, how to sell, how to get students to love a subject or an idea or get excited about something. And my company, I mean, the focus of my company, Science Glen, is really to create tools and courses to help people learn faster, easier, and deeper. That's it. And so that's why I was really so interested in the kind of work that you do, because, but going into more of like the neuroscience of how that works and so on, because there are some people who love learning and they can't stop asking why, and they want to know, And then there's other people who go, whatever, Siri,
Yeah.
and that's all. And so, but there are some people who want to learn and feel stymied by that. And that's one of the things I want to help stop.
Well, that's
Help
where the
anybody.
internet is a great thing, because those who want to fly, they can fly. And as the Buddha says, the enlightened will move so fast through the sky like birds that you won't be able to track them. And that is part of what is happening and what is great about the internet. So a lot of our crises right now is that we have escaped the traditional learning structures and systems. But you make a fair point. Learning how to sell ideas, etc., would be at least as good. And I certainly didn't mean that the teachers should force mnemonics down people's throats, but rather, if they were to use them, then they would more
No,
be
no,
predisposed to do
yeah,
it. But you're right that would be at least an equal, if not a better, thing for them to exemplify.
yeah, no, no. I didn't imply. I didn't mean to imply that you were saying they should force it. I just know how teachers behave,
Right.
and you have some, like any field. There's some who really, do it because they got into the field and they're going to just do it until they retire, and they aren't really trying to excel beyond that. But if you have, I mean, the teachers that do the best are the best salespeople.
Mm.
They
Oh, I
really
think
are.
so. You know
Yeah,
what's so interesting about that? I went to European graduate school for my second MA, and Wolfgang Schirmacher, I don't know what he's doing now, but at that time he was the dean or whatever. And he insisted at the European graduate school that you do not have a bookstore. If you want to read the books, you go and read them, because it's the job of the professor to sell you on the reading. They're there to just talk about what you should be reading. But if they haven't sold you on actually going and doing the reading, then the game is lost. And I think he was exactly right about that. The professor has to make it clear why this is the jam. This is the real deal. And it worked. I mean, I didn't read the single thing, but I read way more during that than what I was told was supposed to be the important stuff.
because he motivated you. That's the essence of a good leader.
But it was a larger structure. Like, it was the way the European graduate school at that time was built,
Uh-huh.
It wasn't just about
So,
him. It was about the policy of how the school worked with respect to readings, assigned readings. There were no assigned readings, none.
so I mean, and that kind of gets into the whole business philosophy. I mean, everything kind of flows from the top down. It's talking about really the structure of that arrangement, the essence of the business, and how everybody behaves in the business, or the academic environment, or in the in the world, or in that particular country, whatever it is. It tends to flow from the top down.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Well,
So
that's what I'm hoping with my theoretical. If teachers were required, it would just naturally flow. And it's a simple request to be able to memorize the names of your students. I mean, it's just logical that you would be able to do that.
So I mean, it's not 30 students; it's 180 students each year.
Well, this is the world's smallest violin. I mean, crying just for these people. That's trivial with mnemonics.
So it's true, and there are some people who are really good at it. And I mean, I had my own way of doing it. It would always take me. I mean, I didn't really try to make, when I was teaching, I didn't try to learn everybody's name in 2 days. I know some teachers do, but within a week or two, I knew it. I had a map written down where everybody sits, and I had the name there. And then when I had to turn back papers, I would basically find them on my own. And over a period of a couple of weeks, I knew everybody's name. And I guess that's just repetition, really, in a different form. And so now, an interesting thing, one of the things in sales that they say is you have to see something 3 times before
I think it's 7 now.
it.
They upgraded it to 7 in recent years.
Well, so I mean, no. So it's 21 if you want to think about it. You have to see something 3 times, but you're only going to see it 1 out of every 7 times somebody does something. So
Right.
it's 3
Okay.
times 7, so it's 21 times basically. You have to see it in 3 different arrangements. So you have to see it like, for example, you see somebody at work, you see somebody at the bar, you see somebody, at their home watching TV.
Mm.
You've seen them in 3 different locations. And so by then they're not just an acquaintance, they're a friend then. And you see them in these different environments. So in a way, I think what I found was like, so for example, people don't have to practice or repeat nightmares or somebody holding them up with a gun to remember that.
Right.
It's something they remember one time because there's so much emotion connected to it, so many other parts of the brain that are then, replayed and thought and so on, and synapses. And so, so one of the things, I don't know, there's this theory, Hobbes theory, neurons that fire together wire together.
Mm.
And so you have neurons that are near each other or always firing in a similar way, then they tend to connect up. There's more synapses that form and so on. But I was just reading just an hour ago or so that in fact, there's a lot of plasticity in the wrapping, the myelination around nerves as well. And so when you repeat something over and over and over, when you have something happening over and over and over, then there is more thicker myelin, more myelin that's forming from the glial cells, the oligodendrite cells. And so the result is that things fire faster and there's stronger connections and so on. And so I think there's a lot of value, an enormous amount of value, especially nowadays when everything is so easy to get things online. There's a lot of value in memory. I mean, because it's like unlike what teachers think. I mean, there were some chem teachers that were seeing these ion flashcards and say, "Oh, shouldn't teach memorization. That's ridiculous." But it's like learning a language without having to know the words.
Yeah. It's a bit strange, but positive things like this emerge, and I'm happy for the opportunity to help spread the word about them.
Thank you. Thank you.
So in addition to the manipulable or the manipulative actual pieces with the magnets and so forth, what's like a timeline, and what ideas do you have for, speaking of business and marketing, for really making it pop so that it gets into the hands that need them?
So, the flashcards are available right now on my website on Amazon. That happens, and there's a major wholesaler that's carrying them as well, the Scientific Supply House. The ionic disc bonding model, these things here, these are in production right now, and they just finished the molds, and they should be available for sale, basically by the end of February. I'll have them in my hands. We're in the process of, so it's an interesting thing. So like I said, there's a Scientific Supply House that's going to be carrying all of our product line, this and everything else. And so schools and school districts and teachers can buy it from there. They're set up for that. They have boots on the ground everywhere in the world, basically, Africa, Australia, wherever. And so that's fine. I'll sell those that way. But what I found, so when you talk about the avatar, the person that is your customer, the person who cares more than anybody is not the teacher, it's the parent. Whether the parent is the parent of a homeschool kid, the parent of somebody who's just struggling with science, the parent of somebody who's got a horrible teacher, the parent of the helicopter parent. Do you call it a helicopter parent in Australia?
Well, I'm Canadian, but I think I get the general idea.
It's the parent that's always hovering.
Right.
They're always there, hovering around, and making sure you gave my son -2 on that. That's not fair. And you only got a B+. You should have had an A. What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
The parent, the helicopter parent. That's the term they use. And then the AP student and so on. And then just the science nerd. So those parents are the ones who care more than anybody. And so one of the things that we're getting ready to do is we're going to be setting up a pre-sale, actually in the next week or so, where we're going to be giving a substantial discount for pre-orders on the basic kit of this. And then when we get them in hand, it was like a Kickstarter, but we're going to be doing it via our own website. And so that's one thing. Other courses that I'm coming up with, I have a bunch of other courses that I'm going to be coming up with, one for chemistry. And I have one that is, I've got this euphemistic name, 37 Steps to Learn Science. No, 37 Steps to Do Well in Science.
That sounds good.
Yeah, so the question is, well, why 37 steps? Why? It's because I made it up. This is just a weird enough number that I made it up, So,
oh, but there's a marketing lesson. We got to figure out a reason why for you.
No, actually, so
but the truth is good. The truth is good too.
Well, no, but actually, numbers like that are odd work better than a rounding number like 40 or 50 or 25. Some odd number works better.
It'd be interesting though. Like, what is there? 118 elements, maybe? Does that sound right?
100. There's 100 and I want to say 118. I think that's what it is.
Imagine that's what I mean by like a reason why. Like, obviously, you maybe don't want a book that has 118 ways to be good in science, but nonetheless, if there's a number like that, some sort of special number, and then you could say, instead of, well, I chose an odd number because it's good at marketing, you could say, this is a very, very special number in science. And I'm sure there is a very special number in science. Like, for example, you couldn't use 0, but something.
Well, I mean, for example, I have 81 flashcards, right? And one of the chem teachers said, I'm not going to buy something with such an odd number. I said, well, but 81 is 9 times 9. And that's the same thing as 3 times 3 times 3 times 3, or 3 to the 4th power. That's just such a cool number. She said, oh, yeah, you're right.
Well, this goes back to that anti-sales
squared.
This goes back to that anti-sales attitude. I don't know why people are so against it. I mean, we have to trade our clamshells, and there's just such negativity around one of the basic aspects of life that it's astonishing. I mean, I do not take any I have no problem calling it slave morality, because in a way that's what it is. You want to be enslaved by the negation of the very thing that feeds you. Like, why would you want to be against it? It's just bizarre to me.
Because I think people think that they want to have control and they aren't being treated fairly.
Well,
and so whether they are or not, and entrepreneurship, I mean, like I said, getting a PhD is great training for entrepreneurship. One of the essences of entrepreneurship is being able to take calculated risks. And
in a world that is unfair, period.
And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, I've failed many times, and each one hurts. But then, that's where the real learning happens. If you're lucky. So I have this great joke. How many years does it take to get 25 years of experience?
I don't know.
It takes at least 50. Because you end up having to do it twice to get it right. And the joke is that it's not a joke. That's really real.
Yeah, if you're lucky, it takes twice as long.
That's right. If you're lucky, if you're lucky. I mean, and that's the real lesson. That's the real learning. And then again, that ties into, things and how the brain works in terms of remembering things that didn't work or whatnot. And memorization is a technique that really can literally save people's lives.
Yeah, especially with the need for, better medicines, and perhaps AI is going to help us find those things, but it's still going to be humans that have to put them together in the lab and do proper trials and blood analysis and to know all this stuff. So again, I can only compliment you for going into the analog realm. You mentioned the word haptic and haptic memory. One of our best memory experts, Lynn Kelly, she says, the hands are the ultimate writing, she says, is the ultimate encryption device or encryption strategy. But it's not just writing itself, it's writing with the hand. Like, that's a very specific thing. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon.
As opposed to typing it, literally handwriting.
And the scientists that have studied this, they don't necessarily know why that writing by hand is generally superior to typing, but I think it's quite obvious when you think about when you snap it onto other things like spatial memory. Where is halfway through a book online? It's nowhere, right? But halfway through this deck, you can eyeball it, and you already are sort of tracking things better because of the spatial dimension, you know. And this little thing I did where I named most of the carpal tunnel bones, like I actually
Right.
point to it, which is part of a spatial strategy. It makes it so much easier. Yes, I have the images, but I also take the time to use my hands. The haptic memory gets involved, and so it's just such a gift that you're doing this, and power to you, and keep going, and thank you for taking the calculated risk, because I understand a little bit of what's involved in these things. I don't know if you know, but I've got a huge project going on with books that will be available in print only, and they're for kids that teach them to have images for all the numbers. And it is a massive calculated risk because there's multiple artists involved and so forth. So
Sure. Oh, yeah.
I'm in
Oh, yeah.
spirit
No,
with you there.
exactly. So I was a publisher for many years.
Oh,
So
good.
I had a book. I had a book I wrote called Pocket Medical Spanish. I sold over 100,000 of those. Did pretty well with them,
Right.
but then I had others that didn't do so well. And I know what you're talking about. I mean, the easiest thing you can do is to write the book. Then you got to get it out there and get people to want to buy it and so on. So there's, somebody might love your book, and then again, somebody might not. You may end up with, what happens to most authors, many authors, is they sell, 10, 15, 20 to friends and family, and the rest of them sit in their garage.
Yeah. And
So it's a risk.
there's a variety of reasons why that happens, but often
No,
it's
it's a risk. So,
yeah.
so I mean, my hat off to you. I mean, really, it's serious. I mean, you're doing the right thing, and if I can do anything to help you with that, please let me know, and I'd be happy to help you with that. I mean, I have a lot of experience in publishing, so that I'd love to help you.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And likewise, I mean, I know the internet marketing better than anything, and even then it's a bit ad hoc. I only have a PhD in humanities, not I wasn't smart enough to actually go into the business school. So, you know, I would say you were very wise to go into the business school, despite.
Well, yeah, well, I don't have a business degree, an MBA or anything. I don't.
Well,
I
that's why
just
the
did.
universities have multiple buildings, so you can go in them. So I think
Oh,
that
I see what you mean. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned in one of the videos, I think it was 21 ways to, memory techniques or ways to improve the
to
memory,
remember things, yeah.
is keep your brain active, keep
Yeah.
learning new things. You exercise, you eat the right foods, and so on. But learning new things, taking risks. I mean, you know, starting a business, doing entrepreneurial stuff, learning a new language, those are all big risks,
Mm.
and some more than others. But, you know, and the other thing is that, there are lots of studies showing that people who keep learning, keep exercising, and who have more education to start with, live longer,
Right. Yeah,
literally.
and we're only scratching the surface with neuroanatomy. I mean, you mentioned the glial cells and so forth. Like anybody who looks into myelinization, like it's just a whole world waiting to be understood. And there's just so much in glial cells alone that is not yet known. And yet at the same time, we have observational effects that people who bring together multiple topics, they create connections, emergent properties. And some of the most recent memory science shows that memory is not in your head. It's in the networked imagination or the networked knowledge systems of other people's heads, and now, well, always in our books and that sort of thing. And like how exactly glial cells get involved in all this, is speculation at a certain level, but nonetheless, just that sort of constant learning, whether you live longer or not, is just going to make you more fit to make connections, to have aha moments, and then have the wherewithal and the mental strength and the grit to take risk, calculated risk, or even uncalculated risk, because that's not necessarily a bad thing either, to experiment.
So, so I've sort of had this dream for many, many years that, imagine you have this world where it gets to the point where when people, meet each other, they say, "Hey, my name is Russ. What do you do?" oh, I do this. Okay. Like, what is my business? What is my profession? Whatever. Instead, it would be like, hey, my name is Russ. I'm learning this. What are you learning?
Yeah, that's a
But
good
the
idea.
focus is knowledge.
Yeah, yeah. Very, very good, good, good point to perhaps wrap things up on. Although I think we could talk forever. That would be a wonderful thing. What are you learning? So thank you for that point as well. Where can people find you and make sure that they're connected? Science Glen, you mentioned. Is it
So
scienceglen.com
science, the
specifically?
word science, and Glen, Glen. And I don't know if you can see this on the bottom here.
Yep.
Science Glen. Okay. And so it's Science Glen's one word, scienceglen.com. And it's available on Amazon. Okay. So Science Glen Ion flashcards.
Yep.
So
And people should also know that if you care about this stuff, don't just get it, use it and review it. And not
absolutely.
not everybody has a blog like I do or a podcast or whatever, but you can get involved and share these ideas around to help with the success of things that make logical sense, they make scientific sense, and they're just a good thing for the world. So
So Anthony, I have a suggestion that maybe could be very useful
mhm.
for everybody.
Yep.
Win-win. So would you be interested in collaborating with me on a project designed to help chemistry teachers teach memory techniques to help their students learn things more effectively?
Oh, certainly I am. It's just a matter of figuring it out. And
Yeah, no. So, but let's collaborate and work out. Maybe create some sort of a course or a free course or a booklet or whatever that they could get either directly for free from the one your website, my website, or from a scientific supply house. In connection with something else, but whatever. I mean, but something specifically for the science teacher, particularly chemistry. Bio is not as difficult, although middle school teachers deal with this too. With like Punnett squares for genetics and things like that,
mm,
and the structure of DNA and things like that. But chemistry, because it's so conceptual.
yeah.
And they talk about science as a second language, and yet they don't teach teachers how to teach that in terms of memory techniques. So that would be a huge opportunity, and I think a big help for everybody.
I think if nothing else, it's a good business development exercise to try to figure out who might be searching for things like that. And I do have a mini project in collaboration that is trying to figure out. And somebody who's gone through my courses, he has set up a nonprofit, not for profit, for this purpose. So there is something already in play that we could discuss in that realm. And it's obviously he's a full-time teacher, so it's a little bit challenging for him to find enough time to work on it and so forth. But at the end of the day, and this is why I say, like, if nothing else, it's a good exercise to try to figure out how to reach the teachers, simply because there are basics of a market, which is if there's no demand, you can have all the supply in the world that you want. And so I don't know enough about if teachers are searching for how to teach better, how are they searching it? And this comes back to this kind of internet is great, but internet is also potentially toxic, because it seems like when teachers are searching, they're teaching for worksheets that enable them to not create their own, which then suggests that they're not necessarily buyers of things that would make them better teachers, but they're copiers. And then, so I think the exercise is there to be figured out, and then some sort of 21 exposure messaging that converts them not just into consumers of a product, but vectors of an idea, vectors of a mission.
So there are things called professional development that every teacher goes through, and so it's almost kind of a case where it's the tail wags the dog, where the teachers want to, if they see that it's working for somebody else, then they'll do it. Right. If the vice principal at the school says, so and so at such and such school is doing well with this, would you consider this too? They might not. If it's free, sure. Hey, I'd be happy to try it. So, if it's a nonprofit that's behind it and has money to do that as a nonprofit, then it's less of a sales thing. It's more of a marketing thing, because you don't have to worry about people wanting to buy it. Then it becomes, the kind of stuff that can be, hey, and look, we tested these kids after doing this, and the ones in this, these set of classes did better with this and versus those over there. That's a TED Talk in itself.
Well, I'll speak with him. I'm only just because I haven't asked him, restricting his name here on our public talk, but see where he's at with the project and maybe connect, because that is in play and it could certainly use more ideas and more momentum, especially since he's a busy teacher himself. But he has exactly this proof of concept. One of his big loves is mind mapping, and he has shown an improvement in his students by getting them to mind map. And so it's
I had a big graphical map on the wall for how the mole relates to the molar mass, and
Anyway, I think it's a great thing, and thank you for raising it. And I don't know how I'm best positioned to help with it, but I'm game to help for sure and collaborate. It's just a matter of working it out. Cool.
You have my email. Anything I can do to help you, let me know.
Will do. And so, people should get this. Thank you for your time and sharing your experiences and how you managed to accomplish your goals and the wonderful entrepreneurial stuff. And congrats on, recovering your memory after such a tragic accident. And scienceglen.com is where to go to find you. And then, as you say, Ion flashcards, Science Glen on Amazon. And again, I would just assert, don't just be a consumer of these things. Get behind it, use it, review it. It really, really helps.
It does. It really will make it. It really works. I'm a work in progress. I'm sure you are.
I fear the person who can't see themselves in that light, but unfortunately they're there.
So much for your time and having me on. I really enjoyed this. This was fun.
Thanks, Russ. Appreciate it. Thanks again to Dr. Russ Dollinger from Science Glen. By the way, I hadn't heard the name Dollinger before or of these cards until he reached out. So you might find it fun just as something to do, related to the use of memory techniques, to know the mnemonic that I used for the name Dollinger. So Dillinger, with a doll, in the hands of a guy I know named Russ. And, there's famous people named Russell that you could use. Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, for example, comes to mind. It's fun and it's easy to create these images, and that's what the magnetic memory method is all about. It's about feeling fun, feeling excited, and feeling alive, based on the principle that the more you know, the more you can know. And now you know about Russ and Science Glen, so get out there, check out these cards, get involved. They might just be what you or someone in your family needs to master chemistry.